Okay, so now let's talk about the important process of diffusion. So, so here's a drop of food coloring into a glass of water. Okay, so what happens is the food coloring concentration is high and it diffuses slowly into the glass, and eventually the food coloring is evenly distributed in the glass. Yeah, so this happens by the random motion of these food coloring molecules. Okay, they're moving randomly in all directions, but since there's no food coloring here, eventually more all this food coloring spreads. Okay, but this is a slow process, and you don't cover large distances in this process. Okay, but this is how capillaries diffusion is the process how capillaries exchange material with interstitial fluid. Okay, so that's why we're studying this. So if a drop of food coloring is placed into a glass, it very slowly spreads out into the entire glass, and until the glass is uniform color. This is an example of diffusion, the movement of substance due to random thermal molecular motion. Okay, due to random thermal molecular motion, even in the absence of large scale flow. So the glass of water is still, there's no large scale flow. The molecules move about, bounce off one another, they bounce off and mix continuously. All right. Materials moved by diffusion thus move much more slowly than the average speed of the molecules. Okay, so what recall that the temperature associated with the average kinetic energy of the molecules, and temperature is associated with the average kinetic energy of the molecules. Oxygen molecules, which for example have an average speed of about 500 meters per second at room temperature in the air, and collide about 5 billion times with other molecules every second. So the oxygen molecule in the air are moving at about 500 meters per second, and they're colliding about 5 billion times a second. These numerous collisions slow down diffusion since molecules cannot travel very fast. So even though they're traveling very fast, because of the collision, they don't travel very fast. They don't travel very far. And once they collide, they're scattered in all directions. So numerous collisions slow down diffusion since molecules cannot travel very far before having a collision. That may scatter them in any direction, including back in the direction they came from. Okay. So the rate of diffusion is given by Fick's law. The direction of diffusion is always from a region of higher concentration to a lower concentration on the average, because there are more molecules moving in that direction than in this direction. So there's a net flow in that direction. The rate of diffusion, the rate at which these molecules diffuse, is directly proportional to the difference in concentration. The concentration here to here. Okay, so the direction of flow is that direction, and the rate of flow depends on the difference in concentration. And eventually, after a while, so the concentration evens out, and then there are as many molecules moving in this direction as in this direction. Okay, so exchange is still happening, but there's no net exchange. Okay, again, so if you have a semi-permeable membrane, there are more molecules hitting in this direction than in this direction, so more molecules diffuse this way. Because molecular motion is random, the molecules move in all directions with equal probability. But there are more molecules on the right, so it's more likely that one of them will move to the left than in this direction. Okay. The greater the difference in concentration, the greater the rate of migration. Migration continues until there are equal numbers on the left and right. The rate of diffusion depends on other factors in addition to concentration difference. Okay, So cohesive and adhesive forces also affect the rate of diffusion. If oil is placed in water, random thermal motion is not sufficient to mix oil and water, since cohesive forces among the oil molecules are larger than adhesive forces between oil and water molecules. Sugar easily dissolves and diffuses in water since its cohesive forces are less than the adhesive forces. So the forces between the sugar molecules, between sugar molecules and between the sugar molecules and water molecules. So the for attractive force between sugar and water molecule, the adhesive force is larger. Okay. The rate of diffusion increases with temperature. This is because the average molecular speed increases with temperature, and the energy available to break cohesive bonds increases. So higher the temperature, more easily can you break the sugar-sugar bonds. Yeah. Thus, sugar diffuses more rapidly in hot water than in cold, and more sugar can be dissolved in hot water than cold. Okay, so here's material being diffusing through this semi-permeable membrane. Okay, transport via diffusion is always slow. So here's a material, let's say interstitial fluid, being transported into the cell. Transport between diffusion is always slow and used mostly at cellular level, where distances are small. So diffusion is used mostly at cellular level. And this is true for osmosis and related processes. Okay, so whenever diffusion, osmosis, and all are involved, distance is moved as small. Unicellular organisms use diffusion and related processes exclusively to transfer food and waste products in and out of the system and to move substances within their system. So when transport is involved in cellular range and within cells, diffusion is used. Okay. We'll talk about passive transport and active transport. Passive, so concentration gradient assists this, and then when you want to move stuff faster, you can facilitate diffusion. Okay. And you can also use pressure. If you apply pressure, the diffusion rate will increase. Or you will see that you can apply pressure, higher pressure here, and move from lower to higher concentration, and that's called filtration, and we'll come to that later. But active transport, you can move stuff from lower concentration region to higher concentration region. Okay, but that requires energy. Okay, so you're moving against a concentration gradient. And so for instance, when you want to absorb nutrients from the intestine, or you want to absorb minerals and stuff like that, there's many occasions when the body moves against concentration gradients, and that'll require energy. Okay. So plants and insects use diffusion to exchange carbon dioxide and water and oxygen with their surroundings. So okay, so insects have these spiracles through which air enters in, and these sparkles branch, and then you're so you're eventually exchanging air with cells. Okay. Plants consume carbon dioxide and excrete oxygen. Carbon dioxide diffuses into plants whenever the concentration inside is less than it is outside. So plants absorb carbon dioxide when the concentration inside them is less. Similarly, excess oxygen and water diffuse out of the plants whenever their concentration are greater than those in the surrounding air. Yeah. So now we'll talk about diffusion through membrane. So here's a membrane, and this is called a semi-permeable membrane. And now this is not entirely understood, but so you can think of small pores, and this is semi-permeable because it'll allow these small molecules to go through, but it'll block these larger molecules. So this membrane is selectively permeable. There are several explanations for why most membranes are semi-permeable. One is that there are pores in some membranes through which substance diffuse. Okay, but the subject is not completely understood. Okay. So other factors are membrane chemistry, cohesive and adhesive forces, charges on the ions involved, and the existence of carrier molecules. Okay, so for instance, this is a carrier molecule which is assisting in transport. Yeah. Most diffusion in biological organisms take place through membranes. So most diffusion in organism takes place through membranes. All cells and structures within cells, such as the nucleus, are surrounded by membranes. These membranes are very thin, about 100 100 times 10 to the minus meters across, 10 to the minus 10 meters across. That's the size of an atom roughly, so less than 100 atom thicks. Most membranes are selectively permeable, that is, they only allow certain substances to cross. So most membranes only allow certain substances to cross. So if you have a larger organism, okay, diffusion is good for single cell organisms. Okay, so if you have larger organisms, you can't have depend on diffusion to go from this end to that end. So you have to have a faster process to cover longer distances. And then when you have to cover the short last mile, so to speak, when you have to reach the cell, then you can use diffusion. So if you have to transport stuff larger distances, you can't depend on diffusion. So transport processes in biological systems become increasingly more complicated in larger organisms. An organism as large as an earthworm requires a tube along its length to move food and waste products. Again, so even a earthworm has to depend on more complicated systems. Okay. Larger organisms have correspondingly more complex systems to transport material in addition to diffusion at the cellular level. So the diffusion is the last mile thing. Okay. Humans, for example, have many billions of capillaries, veins, arteries, lymph ducts, intestine, and a host of other tubes in several complicated systems. So humans have all these complicated systems to transport stuff long distances. So now we'll talk about osmosis. Okay, so you can see that. So here's glucose water, and this is pure water. Okay, so the concentration of water, meaning there's more water per liter on this side than this side. So the concentration of water is greater here. And if you have a semi-permeable membrane which lets through water and not glucose, what will happen is water will diffuse across this membrane to this side. Since there's more water, concentration of water is higher, and water will go through here. And that's called osmosis. Fick's law applies to diffusion through a membrane, although the membrane may slow the process. In most examples, diffusion through a membrane, many different types of molecules are present. So it's important to consider the concentration of the molecule of interest. So now we'll talk about diffusion of water through this membrane. The concentration of water is higher than here, and so water will diffuse here. Okay. So the semi-permeable membrane only allows only water molecules to diffuse through it, not the glucose molecules. Okay. So water will start diffusing to the right. It will diffuse to the point, so now as the water is rising, the pressure is increasing now, and this excess pressure at this point is preventing further diffusion of water. Okay, so this is called the osmotic pressure, the pressure needed to prevent net flow. I mean, prevent flow of water in this direction. And this pressure can be large. And if you have impure water, for instance, you can apply pressure here and make water flow in this direction, and that's reverse osmosis. And so you can go to a store and buy drinking water which has been purified by reverse osmosis. So you can have spring water or whatever which has been purified by reverse osmosis. Water diffuses from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Okay. Water will therefore move from left to right. And it'll continue moving till the pressure here builds up is equal to the osmotic pressure, which now the net flow is zero. Osmosis is usually defined as transport of water through a semi-permeable membrane due to an imbalance of the concentration on either side of the membrane. So water moves through to the right because the concentration is higher here. If osmosis continues, like I said, it continues till this point is reached. Okay. If one of the solutions is pure water, and then the pressure necessary to stop the flow of water from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration is called osmotic pressure. So here is water will move from a higher concentration region to lower concentration region, and this would be the pressure you would need to prevent this flow. Okay. But so when you reach this pressure, you have reached equilibrium. So this is called the osmotic pressure. Okay. Now, if you have two solutions, if you have two sugar solutions, and this is less concentrated than that, that is, there's more water here than here, then you would still have water flowing like that. And that would be called relative osmotic pressure. So if you have two solutions, the pressure is called relative osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure can be rather large. For example, if pure water and seawater are separated by a perfectly efficient semi-permeable membrane that will not pass salt, the pressure necessary to prevent osmosis is 26 atmosphere. That's a huge pressure. So what we're saying is, if you had pure water here and seawater here, and this was a perfectly semi-permeable membrane, this osmotic pressure would be 26 atmospheres. And that is huge. Again, 26 atmospheres is a column of water 260 meters high, 3 football field lengths high. This means that water will diffuse through the membrane until salt water surface is 261 meters above fresh water. So here's a semi-permeable membrane, and here's pure water, and this would rise up to 261 meters. Reverse osmosis takes place when the pressure opposing osmosis exceeds the osmotic pressure. So you can make water flow in this direction if the applied pressure exceeds the osmotic pressure. Okay, so let's say if this is 50 millimeters of mercury, that's the osmotic pressure. If you apply 60 millimeters of mercury, you can have water flow in this direction. And that via reverse osmosis, you can purify impure water. Okay, and that's economical as long as the osmotic pressure is not too large. For ocean water, that the osmotic pressure is too large, and that's so desalinating ocean water is expensive. So reverse osmosis takes place when the pressure opposing osmosis exceeds the osmotic pressure. Okay. Reverse osmosis can be used to desalinate seawater, but it is not economical due to the lack of efficient and durable membranes. Yeah. So desalination is an expensive process. So we'll talk about osmosis in biology. So here's a plant, here's water in the soil, and you know, see this water concentration is higher. There's more water per liter than in the sap in the roots, and so water will diffuse into the sap. Okay, so that's how plants uptake. So this is a root hair of a plant. Water in sap. Okay, so osmosis between root and groundwater is thought to be responsible for transfer water into many plants. So that's okay. Groundwater is purer and hence has a higher water concentration than sap. So osmosis moves water into roots. Water in the sap is transferred by osmosis into cells. The cells have a lower concentration of water, so from the sap to the cell also you have an osmosis transfer. Okay. Now, moving water up tall trees, this is still not very well understood, but there's probably several mechanisms going on. So you're transferring water to the roots via osmosis, and then maybe, so these are some of the theories. Water is transported up xylem via cohesion. So the water molecules form a chain and they also attach to the xylem wall. So that's one of the proposals. And then also when water evaporates from the leaves, as one water molecule evaporates, see all this chain gets pulled up. So it's probably a combination of all three that transport water all the way to the top. Okay. Now, there are situations where, okay, so we explained absorption of water via osmosis, but there are situations when plants can take in water even from salty water solutions where the concentration of water is less than in the sap. Okay, so if this is saltier than the sap, there are plants that still are able to absorb water. So, okay. So other processes in addition to osmosis are probably involved in the uptake of water. Since some plants grow in salt water, that would remove water from the plant if only osmosis was present. Okay. So here's a use of osmosis. So when your feet are swollen, you can soak them in Epsom salt. Okay. So the concentration of water is higher in your interstitial fluids than here. Okay. This is saltier than your interstitial fluid, and water via osmosis will come up. Okay, and you can reduce the swelling in your feet. Osmosis transports water out of the ankle into the soaking solution. The concentration of water in the swollen part of the ankle is greater than in the Epsom salt solution. So there's more water per unit volume than in the Epsom salt, and that water comes out via osmosis. Okay, so here is a very important concept. So there are your cells and there is interstitial fluid, and here's a capillary. Okay, you saw that the pressure on the arterial end can be as high as 35 millimeters of mercury, and here on the venial end it's about 15 millimeters of mercury. Okay, there's the concentration of water, the osmotic pressure. There's more water here than in your blood, so the osmotic pressure is about 22 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so I'll show that to you in a second. So the osmotic pressure is 22 millimeters of mercury. Okay. Now in the capillary, okay, because of this high blood pressure, see this pressure is greater than that, so water will leak out, water will flow in this direction, and nutrients will also flow out in this direction, and also so in some cases waste product also flow out this way. Okay. And at this end, so water flows out from here, from because the pressure is higher in this end, and since at the venule end, okay, the pressure dropped because of the resistance in the flow rate equal to pressure drop times the resistance, and for a certain flow rate there was a pressure drop because of resistance, so this pressure drop was because of resistance. Okay, and now the pressure is dropped to 15 millimeters, and now water will flow back into the capillaries. Okay, now if this pressure was too high, if this pressure was higher than 22 millimeters of mercury, now the water can't flow back in, and you would have water collecting in your interstitial fluids, and that's edema. Okay, so we'll talk about why the pressure would rise here. So for instance, if you have a right heart failure, this pressure would rise and water would collect in your ankles. Okay, in humans and other animals, the interstitial fluid is regulated by exchange of substance with the blood in the capillaries. So the interstitial fluids exchanges substance with the capillaries, with blood in the capillaries. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and wastes are exchanged through the thin walls of the capillary. So oxygen, nutrients, waste, they're all exchanged through the walls of the capillary. So here we'll just consider exchange of water, and we'll come to the nutrients and wastes later. The figure shows that the blood process under average conditions. So here's blood at 35. Blood enters the top right, and because the capillary is small in diameter, there's a significant pressure drop. Pressure is typically about 35 millimeters at the entrance and 15 millimeters at the exit. So, and the osmotic pressure is about 25. Relative osmotic pressure is 25 millimeters of mercury. So water comes out this way, and water goes in here. Okay. Water is more concentrated in the interstitial fluid than in the blood, but the typical osmotic pressure difference between the blood and the interstitial fluid is 22 millimeter of mercury. So the osmotic pressure in this direction is 22 millimeters of mercury. Reverse osmosis therefore occurs near the entrance of the capillary, okay, because the pressure is higher. Reverse osmosis occurs here. Blood pressure near the capillaries exit is less than the relative osmotic pressure. Here the pressure is less, so the osmosis occurs here, and water goes back this way. And osmosis carries water from the interstitial region to the capillary. The overall result is the exchange of water while the total amount of water in the interstitial remains constant. So again, don't forget that nutrients and oxygen are also coming in here. So we've taken care of the water. We didn't want water to collect. And so these pressures are what ensures that the water doesn't collect here. And then all the other materials can be exchanged. So the overall result is an exchange of water while the total amount of water in the interstitial region remains constant. Departures from this normal behavior can occur for any number of reasons, and the result is either too much water in the interstitial region. So if this pressure gets higher, then there'll be too much water in the interstitial region, okay? Or so water in the interstitial region, or too little. And if this pressure gets lower, too much water can leave the interstitial region. Okay. So both or too little. Both conditions are medically unfavorable. Edema or buildup of interstitial fluid creates swelling in those regions. Okay. Okay, so too high a pressure here creates too much water. Too low a pressure will create too little water. Edema, the right side of the heart receives blood from the veins. If the patient suffers right heart failure, then the heart is less effective in taking up blood sent to it, and the pressure at the exit of capillaries rises. So normal pressure is 15 millimeters of mercury, and that allows water to go in that direction. Okay, and water won't collect there. But if you have right heart failure, this pressure rises. Okay, this causes reverse osmosis along. If this pressure rises, water will flow in this direction everywhere, and the fluid. This causes reverse osmosis all along the capillary and the buildup of interstitial fluid called edema. So if this pressure rises, fluid will flow. This pressure rises about 22 millimeters of mercury, fluid will be flowing in this direction. Fluid collects here, and that's edema. So the fluid usually collects in the leg, back, and buttocks where there's high when there is right heart failure. The left side of the heart receives blood from the lungs. Left heart failure increases pressure in the lungs, causing reverse osmosis there. This water buildup is called pulmonary edema and is an extremely dangerous condition. For the patient can literally drown in his own fluid. All right, let's pause and then we'll start another recording.